The Watercraft Order that came into force in March 2023 is primary legislation that allows the government to control the use of what are known as personal watercraft. Personal watercraft are any vessel that can carry at least one person and is propelled by its own machinery. Personal Watercraft Order basically makes every vessel that falls into this category a British ship, and therefore subjects it to the legislation that applies to British vessels. Good examples of this are the Merchant Shipping Act, the collision regulations, and other laws that prevent vessels being used to harm, injure, or affect other people on the water. Despite this legislation being in place for nearly 1 year now, it's staggering how many yacht clubs are unaware of its existence and, more importantly, unaware of the effect that the Watercraft Order may have on the activities in which they run. Even the use of small vessels, such as small rescue vessels in sailing regattas, and especially the use of powered watercraft for leisure activities, are controlled heavily by the Watercraft Order, and the implications of its ignorance can be plain for all to see. If any of these vessels is used in such a way that it creates a nuisance, that is dangerous, that pollutes the marine environment, or in some other way does not comply with the UK's Merchant Shipping Act, then fundamentally the person purporting to be in command of that watercraft could be subject to prosecution. At the end of the day, knowledge of the Watercraft Order isn't good enough. It will require a complete rethink on behalf of those that operate small vessels as to how they propose to take their vessels to sea, what they do with their vessels when they're at sea, and the basic checks that they should make to ensure that any activities that they undertake are undertaken in a way that does not contravene any of the legislation which the Watercraft Order now brings into force upon these small vessels. Yacht clubs in particular would do well to review the Watercraft Order, and in particular review the legislation that is empowered by it, to ensure that their current risk assessments and current procedures do not contravene any of the legislation that has now been brought into force by the Watercraft Order itself. Furthermore, the education of members that operate such craft and the analysis of the qualifications that they may and may not hold to ensure that they are able to operate these craft competently need to be undertaken before the sailing season starts. It's imperative that those whose names appear on the risk assessment have taken into account the Watercraft Order and do not use the activities of small craft within the risk assessment to reduce risk in a way that may break any of the legislation that the Watercraft Order brings into force. One good example is sending small vessels on long passages in order to assist with racing. Those small vessels must have a passage plan in place, and at the very least must be able to show that things like weather conditions, manning and seaworthiness of the vessel were taken into account prior to taking the vessel to sea to marshal or act as a safety boat with such a race. Failure to do so may render the person purporting to be in command of that watercraft to prosecution if subsequently something were to happen to that vessel whilst on passage, or even something were to happen to one of the members in the race that was caused by the activities or neglect of the person driving the rescue boat. It is imperative that yacht clubs build this new legislation into their risk assessments so that at the end of the day they can show the MCA, port authorities and anybody else with a vested interest in their risk assessment that they have taken into account the requirements of the Watercraft Order through their training and risk preparation. The primary target for the watercraft legislation was personal watercraft, who for years had not only considered themselves perhaps to be above the law, but had indeed been judged to be above the law, escaping prosecution on numerous accounts due to the fact that they were not considered to be a ship. Personal watercraft now, under the new Watercraft Order, are a ship. They are propelled by their own machinery and they are capable of carrying at least one person. That makes them a British ship under the order. It means that they are subject to the British Merchant Shipping Act, and most importantly, it means that enforcement can be brought to bear upon those purporting to be in command of such vessels when they use their vessels in such a way as to endanger other persons or threaten the marine environment. You must always take into account that you can be held liable for the actions that you subsequently perform. Moreover, when you perform those duties within a harbour authority, that harbour authority can now use the full force of its legislation to ensure that you do not create a nuisance whilst using your craft, that you do not injure anybody, and that you do not create pollution of the marine environment. You are now a UK ship and subject to the laws that apply to UK vessels. Risk assessments must reflect the ability for the persons in command of such vessels to be able to conduct them safely, efficiently, and without causing a nuisance to any other users on the water. This means that clubs, regattas, and other large organisations must put in place enhanced training measures to ensure that their crews are able to safely deal with any situation that arises whilst complying with the legislation that comes with the Watercraft Order. This will most likely necessitate a complete rethink of any previous risk assessments, and although generic in value, may need to be fine-tuned for each different regatta and race, depending upon the scope, distance and use of such vessels under the Watercraft Order. Essentially, education is better than prosecution, and at the end of the day, educating people as to what their specific requirements are, the duties that they are expected to perform and the standards that they are expected to demonstrate whilst operating a watercraft is very, very important. Simply training in the old-fashioned way of teaching people to drive small boats along regular lines of traffic cannot overcome the pressures that are there when it comes to passage planning, safety, safe speed, and in the end of the day, compliance with the collision regulations themselves. So, to summarise, the Watercraft Order has brought big ship legislation into the field of small vessels in order to ensure that regardless of the size of the ship, if the vessel is propelled by its own machinery and therefore classed as a watercraft, it must comply with the same basic legislation that larger vessels comply with. Let's not forget that vessels of different sizes do have to comply with different levels of standards, and we're not saying that a 7-metre rib has to comply with the same standards as a 300-metre container ship. What we're effectively saying is that both vessels are now British ships, and therefore the legislation that exists for that size of vessel now applies to that ship. This ensures that no fundamental laws, particularly those laws designed to keep the operation and conduct of these vessels safe, bypass any type of vessel, and any vessel propelled by its own machinery, classed as a watercraft, is both compliant and safe.